Yeah. It's funny that happened so quick. Unbelievable. Okay. Leviticus chapter 4. Let's get there. And as we get to this part of the text, and these are the different offerings that were to be given for different reasons. And as I read through these things, I got to tell you, and I don't know if you guys kind of catch on to this too, but when we live in the New Testament sense, we really have such little understanding of what this must have been like. And what we're going to look at is the fourth and the fifth of the 5 offerings. The first 3 would have been involuntary. They're left for the person to be able to do of their own will. And they were offered with frankincense, and they were considered sweet-smelling aromas to the Lord. Now, you'll notice that these are also 4 of the 5 offerings were of animals, as these last 2 are. Only one of them was a grain offering, but because it would have aromatics with it, like frankincense, it would have a sweet aroma to it in addition to just the animal. These last 2 involve animals as well, but they are not considered sweet-smelling. They have nothing. You'll notice there's nothing of frankincense that's offered with them. But these last 2 offerings are voluntary. They're compulsory. You're going to do this if you're going to be in a right place before the Lord, because you're making restitution. And you'll notice that there is, in both of these, kind of the unintentional things that you've done, but one of them is a sin offering. The other one is a trespass offering, and it's how you do things between brothers and sisters, or in a more formal sense, probably more towards priesthood and depriving them of things, which we'll get into when we go through this. But the formality of this, let's remember at the end of it all of these offerings really only make perfect sense when we view them in the eyes of the New Testament, because they were always temporary. And so if you really want a good indication of that, you just simply need to read through the book of Hebrews, and you'll recognize how the arguments that are made there across the board of everything in the way that it was done in Israel were for a time, but they were never able to take away the sin problem. They were never able to be satisfactory permanently as far as God was concerned, so these were being done all the time. Now, remember also, this is a part of the law that is given to them in their years before they even came back into the land, right? So this is after the Exodus, but a long, long time before they were ever going to come back into the land. So what's being given here is kind of the law of offerings, but it should have been really kind of followed from the time that it was given in their sojourn in the wilderness until they came into the land, and until they were able to establish the temple. And once the temple was in place, these are the laws of how it was supposed to be. And these are the offerings. These are how they were to be made. There's a really good website. I don't know if you're aware of it. Let me give it to you for you to take a look at, because sometimes it's kind of cool. I brought an example of it if you want to come up and see it afterwards. But it's just one of the charts that you can get, and it compares the different offerings. Pretty cool. But the website's called Precept Austin, like Texas. Precept Austin. And it's a free website with more commentary and more charts and information than you could shake a stick at. And so if you're interested in looking at those things, there's so much here it would be impossible for me to try to get it and put it up and project it and all the rest of that. It wasn't my intention when we started going through Leviticus. But I really think that it's very helpful to have that understanding and that knowledge, and really come to a full appreciation for what we are able to experience as believers, not having to repeat these things. Now, let me just ask you this before we move on. How many of you have been here for the past few times we've been together and we've gone through the different offerings? This is the 3rd week we've been doing offerings. How many of you have been here for it? And to a person, can you not say, "Oh, I am so glad we don't have to do that"? Huh? Yeah? Now, if you're able to say that, then you have to ask, so does God not care about sacrifice? Of course he cares about sacrifice. We've dealt with that over these last couple of times we've been together. And so a sacrifice, a perfect one, in the person of Jesus makes all of this unnecessary. So thank God for that. So all of this was a foreshadowing of what would be done by Jesus on behalf of believers once and for all. And now the sacrifices we looked at in the first week when we went through this, now the sacrifices on our part. We're to offer ourselves as living sacrifices, holy, acceptable to God, that being our reasonable service. So Romans 12, 1 and 2. So you get the picture in the big picture of this. All of this was being done to show how the people of God could walk honorably and rightly before God. So there was the burnt offering, there was the grain offering, there was these offerings of these various types that you get in the first really 7 chapters. The 5 of them are dealt with in the first 5 chapters, and then chapters 6 and 7 will give us more definition on it as we go through, and we'll get to that 2 weeks from tonight. We'll get to the last part of this, and then we'll start to move through Leviticus. But what we're going to notice as we go through this, so much of what we understand and how we walk before God here and now really was covered in this book. And so it gives us an understanding of why things are as they are. Give me 1 second. I need to move something here. Need to get the mic a little closer. You guys okay? Able to hear in the back there all right? What? Is that it? Are you able to, in the back, everybody able to hear okay? All right, great. I could see it looked like it was further away from me. Believe it or not, how the legs on this chair are situated makes so much of a difference. So anyway, chapter 4 of Leviticus, let's have a look there. And Father, we would ask that you would help us in our understanding. Even as what we looked at this morning, just it happens to be where we are in the text. This morning of walking rightly and honorably before you and being content with those things which you've given to us. Or tonight as we look at the offerings that were here and understanding the seriousness with which you take the matter of sin and how everything has been taken into account and you've made restitution possible. God, I pray that none of us would sin with impunity, as is our normal course of things, but that we would come to a full understanding, a full grip of what it was that was done on our behalf in the person of Jesus, fulfilling what had always been. So we thank you for giving us your word that we might be able to look with our eyes wide open at how serious the matter is. Help us not to be forgetful in our hearing, and we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. One last thing. I just got to tell you, over these last the last 2 studies, the one from this morning and the one tonight, looking at this, I am really reminded at the holiness and the perfection of God and how absolutely unholy and imperfect we are as humans. The contrast is so obvious. And as you read through these things, it is one where you really, if you're, where I've been as I'm reading this, between us, I'll just say, it is so important that we recognize how pure and how right and how holy he is. And goodness, it is a really, really eye-opening kind of a thing to come to grips with that. Well, let's take a look at chapter 4, and he'll lay out for us in the first couple of verses the general theme, and then he'll start to go into specifics, and it really gets kind of categorized by the position of the people that are being addressed, and I'll make note of that, or it's pretty obvious in the text. But it says in verse 1, now the Lord spoke to Moses. This continues a pattern that the communication was directly to Moses, and it was going to have the effect on the people as he would explain to them how it was that they were to make things right between themselves and then between they and God. And so in verse 2 it says, now speak then to the children of Israel. So the communication, let me do this one last thing before we get in, and I might have mentioned this in the weeks before, but since I've been mentioning a lot about how much things have changed because of the person of Jesus, notice the chain of custody. God speaks, Moses hears, and then Moses is to be taking these bits of information to the people. This is what is acceptable. So you have a layer of mediation in this place. God to Moses, Moses to man. And since we're talking about what Jesus has done, I'll refer you, and you can read it yourself if you'd like to later on, but the very first few verses of the book of Hebrews says that God at various times and in various ways spoke to the fathers through the prophets. Now he spoke to them in other ways as well, but the ones that spoke forth. Great. But what it tells us now is, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. So if you realize, take a good look at it, he's removed one entire layer of mediation. God, because Jesus is God in the flesh, God came personally to deliver the message and took out the middleman. You get it? So it's fantastic that you have in Jesus the very representation of God because he's the Son. He is God in the flesh. So God doesn't have to speak through a person to get to the rest of us. He is able to be here in person to minister to us, and because of his mediation, removes all of what we see here. You get it? Pretty amazing, isn't it? All right. So chapter 4, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, if a person unintentionally sins unintentionally against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and does any of them." So here's what you're going to say. It's the unintentional. It wasn't intended to happen. It was just kind of, let's just make this the blanket statement. It was done in the heat of the moment. Well, I didn't intend to, but I just got caught up in the moment, right? That's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. Not deliberative, not thought through. It wasn't premeditated, but it is still nonetheless something that God rejects. It's still against his law, but there wasn't forethought to it. It just kind of happened. It was heat of the moment kind of thing. That's what's being mentioned here, the unintentional things. God still does not say, well, you didn't mean it, it's okay. Now, isn't that interesting how oftentimes we will hear that of people who claim to be Christians says, well, God knows my heart. I love, there's a great picture out there of a guy who looks like he's yelling at someone else, and the caption says, well, God knows my heart, and the guy that's like really angry said, that should terrify you. So that shouldn't be an excuse. If anything, the idea that God knows your heart should be a real motivation to get it right with him. Yeah? So here it is, the unintentional sin. Okay, so if the anointed priest sins, notice this kind of starts at the top of where they are at the time. There's no kings, right? There's none of those guys. These are the representations of the representatives, rather, who mediate between God and man. So the priesthood is starting way up at the top. Now, it doesn't mention anything about Moses, but Moses is the messenger. So aside from Moses, you've got the priests here, and that's kind of right up at the top. If the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord for his sin, which he has sinned, a young bull without blemish as a sin offering. And he will bring the bull to the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord, lay his hand on the bull's head, and kill the bull before the Lord. Now, this is common. We've read this in the other offerings. The reason for the offering is different this time, because remember, this is unintentional sin. This is now voluntary. You have to do this. The other ones were free will offerings, sweet-smelling aromas. This is not that, because the preparation is different. So in this case, beginning with the priesthood. Now, the priesthood would have brought defilement because of where their operation was. That is in the tabernacle. So they have brought this offense into the very holy place. That's why you'll notice that it's a little different as we go down the scale a bit, even in this chapter. Even the way that the blood would be atoning and where the offering would be offered up, it's a whole different story. So we see in verse 4, then he's going to bring this bull to the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord, lay his hand on the bull's head, and kill the bull before the Lord. And then the anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood and bring it to the tabernacle of meeting. Then the priest will dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil of the sanctuary, or sanctuary. So this gives you the understanding that this is different from the other offerings, because now the veil begins to be a part of this. And this is the not wanting to profane the actual tabernacle itself. You'll notice in the later offerings for the same offense, because of who it was that offended, it's not the same way. It's different. But if this is the priesthood, then it is becoming a problem of the corporate place of worship among the people. That's a big deal. So it's the defiling of the sanctuary, and that's why it's different. Now notice in verse 7, so the priest will put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of sweet incense before the Lord, which is in the tabernacle of meeting, and he shall pour the remaining blood of the bull at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the door of the tabernacle. So if you remember when we had that picture of the tabernacle and where it all was, there were all these different places, and they're pretty easy to see when you see a diagram of it, and everything to this point has taken place inside of the tent area, right? So verse 8, so he will take from it all of the fat of the bull as a sin offering, the fat that covers the entrails, the fat which is on the entrails, the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them by the flanks, and the fatty lobe attached to the liver above the kidneys he shall remove. And as it is taken from the bull of the sacrifice of the peace offering, the priest shall burn them on the altar of burnt offering. So it's going to be consumed, right? So then what's left? What of the meat? What of the skin? What of the legs? What of the head, right? We've been through this enough times, studying through this. Okay, I get it. This is a lot of the internal stuff, but not all of it. There are some very, very slight differences in this, even to this point. Notice what happens after that. So, verse 10, but the bull's hide. Now, what had been happening with the bull's hide in the burnt offering before? It was left for the priests, right? Now, this is the priest who is offended. So now what happens with it? So, verse 11, the bull's hide and its flesh, its head and its legs, its entrails and offal. The whole bull he shall carry outside the camp to a clean place where the ashes are poured out, and burn it on wood with fire. Where the ashes are poured out, it shall be burned. So this is the place when they would take the ashes out of the offerings during the day-to-day course of things. There was a place where the ashes would rest. This is where you're going to offer that animal. This is where it's going to be fully consumed, but it's outside the camp. So once again, there is a picture that is being illustrated here for us. You could ask the very simple question if you were here or if you're just reading this, why outside the camp? Why does that matter? Why not inside where all the rest of it is taking place? And, there's been a defilement, unintentionally, but a defilement nonetheless, that's something that it was done by the priests. And this is not to be done inside, because this is to be an offering to take care of the problem, but it'll be done outside the camp. Again, if you read the book of Hebrews, we are told about Jesus being offered outside the camp. Now, the reason that they would have never done what they did, and the reason of putting him outside, was they weren't going to defile the temple, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, Jesus was taken outside the camp, and it was a fulfillment of all of this. Now, only God could see that, because he sees the ends from the beginning, or the beginnings from the end, however you want to say that. He does this because it is a recognition of what is to come. There's no way that anybody reading this at the time, or when this was put there, they wouldn't have an understanding of that. There's no way that they could. But God's telling a story for those who would see afterwards, and the writer of Hebrews would be able to explain it. To our eyes, think about it this way. To our eyes, it makes perfect sense. Because that's what they did with Jesus. They took him outside of the city, outside of the camp, outside of the dwelling of Israel, if you will. They took him outside of the city and offered him up there. Or killed him there, but he was ultimately offered as an offering for sin. So you get all the imagery that's going on here? Okay, so, and then it says, now, if the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally, and the thing is hidden from the eyes of the assembly, and they have done something against any of the commandments of the Lord, and anything that should not be done, and are guilty. Now, here's what will happen for them. Now, that's quite a bit of discussion there, and it's pretty easy. There are two things that almost sound like the same thing. Because the first part of that is it says the whole congregation of Israel, right? So that would just give you that would give the impression, well, it's the rank and file. It's just the people living in the tents, right? That's what it sounds like. Well, but then notice what it says. If the whole congregation of Israel sins unintentionally and the thing is hidden from the eyes of the assembly. Okay, well, that seems to be a different matter as well. There's what is the assembly and what is the congregation. So as you see, this is in a kind of a descending order. And so there are those that would look at this, and the wording of it gives the impression that this would be kind of like the leadership. Not as much the people themselves, because the people are going to be addressed later. The common people is what they're referred to, the assembly. But this would be more the leadership if they've done such a thing, because you'll notice that their recompense or their offering is greater than what we're going to see when we get to, say, verse 27, when it is just the common people. So if that is the case, that the leadership has done something that is hidden from the eyes of the general population of Israel, then there is restitution that they need. Let's read what they're supposed to do, and we'll look at one of the possible examples of where something like this would happen. So if the congregation of Israel sins unintentionally, and the thing is hidden from the eyes of the assembly, and they have done something against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which should not be done, and are guilty, when the sin which they have committed becomes known, then the assembly shall offer a young bull for the sin, and bring it before the tabernacle of meeting, and the elders of the congregation shall lay their hands on the head of the bull before the Lord. That's why it helps you to understand. This is the headship, the elders. They're the ones taking responsibility for the issue. So they're the ones that would do this when it is about to be offered up. And then the bull shall be killed before the Lord, and the anointed priest will take some of the bull's blood to the tabernacle of meeting, and then the priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil. Once again, this is in the very innermost parts. The veil is, that's inside. That's right there. So, and he shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar, which is before the Lord, which is in the tabernacle of meeting, and he will pour the remaining blood at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So that's just outside. And he shall take all the fat from it and burn it on the altar. And he shall do with the bull as he did with the bull for the sin offering. Thus he will do with it. So the priests will make atonement for them, and it shall be forgiven them. And then they shall carry the bull outside the camp. Once again, there it is. Outside of the camp. It is not to be done because the defilement, because of how high up it goes, becomes a matter of formal worship and for the known leaders within the nation. You'll notice that that is not going to be happening in the lesser of the offenses because of who the people are. So the higher up the people are who have offended, the more ceremonial and the more important it is, because it is to try to restore not only the right relationship between people, but before the Lord. So you get that? Look at what it says again. Then they shall carry the bull outside the camp in verse 21. Burn it as they burned the first bull. It is a sin offering for the assembly. So this deals with the sin. Remember, this was unintentional, and that's why there are some differences in this, because it is not something that they will partake of. It is to be fully consumed, but in this case, even the skin, the hide, everything, there's nothing left behind of it. Now, is there an example of this? Because here's the thing. They're given these prescriptions, but it's not as though you see them happening all the time where you have obvious examples that immediately come to mind, and none are given. Now, why is that? Well, because none of the offenses have happened yet. This is like down the road when these things take place, here is how you fix the problem. You get it? So when these things happen, here is the course of action that will take care of the problem. That's what we're reading here. So what we see in, let me give you an example of it. This is one that's pointed to very often in Joshua chapter 9. Let's go there. Bless you. Joshua 9. Now, when you read through this, I'm not going to read every verse of it, but you'll kind of get the flavor of it. And this is a time when the Gibeonites they're starting to encounter the Gibeonites, the children of Israel are. And so you see in verse 1 of chapter 9, and it came to pass when all the kings who were on the other side of the Jordan, in the hills and in the lowland, and on the coasts of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite, Amorite, Canaanite, Perizzite, Hivite, Jebusite heard of it, they all gathered together to fight with Joshua and Israel with one accord. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard that what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily and went and pretended to be ambassadors, and they took old sacks on their donkeys with old wineskins torn and mended. So what this is, there's a pretense. These guys have not come from a long ways away. So what they offer is all this beat up, worn out stuff, moldy bread and all the rest of it. And they say, we've come from a far land. We're not the local guys that you would otherwise know us to be. They're doing this craftily. Notice what you see in verse 12. This bread of ours that we took hot for our provisions from our houses on the day that we departed to come to you, but now look, it is dry and it is moldy. And these wineskins which are filled were new, and see, they are torn, and these our garments and our sandals have become old because of a very long journey. And so the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but they did not ask counsel of the Lord. There is the offense, right? So if they had come to the Lord and said, these guys got a great story, but is this true? Then God would have said, no, they're lying to you. They're just the local guys and they're afraid of you and all the rest. There still could have been a way to say, look, we don't have a problem with you guys. However, that was not the case. The pretense was put up. The unintentional offense in this case is that they made a pact with these people whom they never should have made a pact with, and they wouldn't have done it had they consulted the Lord in the first place. There's one of your examples that you could say an unintentional thing. The leaders of the congregation did what they should not have done, in this case with Joshua, when they've come into the land. So it's just one of examples that you could give, but it's a pretty obvious one. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, so if that's the case, here's the provision that's made for it. Remember, the sacrifice is burned outside of the camp because it's not only a corporate thing as far as the nation is concerned, but being done by the leadership, then it becomes a matter of rightness before the Lord, nationally speaking. And so the offering was the same kind. Have to get it right before the Lord. This is something that affects the entirety of the nation. And so there is the going into the veil. There's the really, really serious matters that were taking place. Notice that there's going to be a little change that's beginning to take place. When a ruler has sinned. Now, ruler in this case would be seen more as head of tribes, head of groups. Okay, so you see the descending way. It starts with the priests, then it goes to the elders. Now at this place, heads of families, heads of tribes. So when a ruler has sinned and done something unintentionally against the commandments of the Lord, his God, in anything which should not be done and is guilty, or if his sin which he has committed comes to his knowledge, he will bring as an offering a kid of goats, a male without blemish. So it's no longer bulls. This can be done with goats. Okay, so again, the person and the magnitude of the offense is kind of commensurate with the person's position. So still an important thing, and yeah, it was done unintentionally, but still things need to be repaired. It has to be fixed. So in this case, he can bring a goat. So, verse 24, he will lay his hand on the head of the goat and kill it in the place where they killed the burnt offering before the Lord. It is a sin offering. So it's going to have all the same effects of the sin offering. But again, remember, this is not, you'll notice nowhere in these two offerings, the one that we do here and the one in the next chapter, you will not find it where it says, and it will be a sweet smelling aroma before the Lord. Totally a different thing. Remember, these ones, you have to do these. The first three were voluntary, but if you didn't avail yourselves to them, you're not going to be in a right way with the Lord. So they were, without being told you have to do these things, they're voluntary, but if you want to be right with the Lord, you're going to do them anyway, right? These ones are different. You must do this. These were sins that were unintentional, but you're still guilty of them. Here's what you must do. So, verse 25, so the priest will take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar of the burnt offering and pour its blood at the base of the altar of burnt offering. Do you notice what's missing? The veil, the dipping of the finger, the 7 times, the veil. None of that stuff is mentioned here because you're no longer dealing with the priesthood. You're no longer dealing with the elders of the nation. You're still dealing with important people. These are heads of the families, heads of the tribes, and yet there still needs to be the offering for sin, but notice that there's nothing burned outside the camp either. So you see in verse 26, and he will burn all of its fat on the altar, like the fat of the sacrifice of the peace offering, and so the priest will make atonement for him concerning his sin, and it will be forgiven. You notice the change that's taken place there? Now that will continue through verse 27, where you see now it is for the common people. if any one of the common people sins unintentionally, and by doing something against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and is guilty. Now, do you see how broad that is, by the way? It's easy to just read it over, but it's been said a number of times. Look at how that is said, again, verse 27. If any of the common people sins without intent. I got caught up in the moment. I didn't deliberate. I didn't think about it. It just happened. And you'll notice in some of these things it is, and they didn't know, but then it's brought to their attention later. It could be that benign that you didn't even know that you had done it at that point. You didn't even know. It becomes known to you after the fact. So notice what is said. Unintentionally, by doing something that is against any, notice any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and is guilty. Or if his sin which has been committed comes to his knowledge. So there it is. You didn't even know at the beginning. Then he shall bring as an offering a kid of the goats, a female without blemish, for his sin which he has committed. Now you're going to notice it doesn't even necessarily have to be a female of the species. It can even be, we'll get to the place of birds, which is not uncommon. Remember, we read that in the earlier offerings, that if you didn't have the wherewithal, it doesn't have to be a bull because you're not at the leadership. You're among the common people. You'll notice it's all the way down. They could offer grain offerings. It wasn't that it had to be the same exact animal. It was going to be done based upon what a person could offer. It wasn't as much the offering of what it was technically, but it is the heart of the person based upon what they could bring. They were to make restitution for these things. So let me point out something else that's interesting that we're going to see as we go through Leviticus. And by the time that there were the laws that God gave, if you've been here since we started in Exodus, and you read through Exodus and this far in Leviticus, let me just ask you, are there a lot of things that you would have to remember? Did I do this or did I do that? You're going to be doing that all the time. Do you think that you could go through the course of a day and violate in one part of it and not even know it? Yeah, you could. Now, let me make sure I also don't make light of this. God put these things in place for a reason. These are the standards of perfection. The law is perfect, absolutely perfect. And that's why Paul would say if there was a way that man could be right by actions and by deeds, it would be the law. Why? Because it's the only one that God ever gave. It's his prescription. But when you start to see it in its entirety, plus the things that they did in their defining of what these things were, because some of them are so open, when you start to see anything, when you have words like that, well, somebody's going to have to define what is anything and what is everything. So by the time all of the other parts of it are put in and the laws are all tallied up, it's over 600 of them, and goodness, how can you possibly keep that? And again, we've looked at it already, but I'll reemphasize it. This is why Paul says that the law brings us to Jesus. And what do we say when we come to him? I can't do this. It's perfect. It's exactly what God wants, but I am totally incapable. And God is able at that point to say, that's the point. I still demand it. It is still in force. You still must do these things, but since you cannot do them, Jesus did them in the atoning sense, as we see here. So all of our guilt of not keeping a perfect law fell upon him, and we walk with him by faith. But let's not deceive ourselves in thinking that somehow because of Jesus none of this stuff matters. Oh, it matters all right. And that's why he paid the price that he did, because it does matter. But boy, as I read this, I am so thankful to be able to say at the end of the day, thank you, Jesus. So, in verse 29, so he shall lay his hand on the head of the sin offering. Once again, this is the recognition of my guilt for this animal's innocence. Lay his hand on the head of the sin offering and kill the sin offering at the place of the burnt offering. The priest will take some of its blood on his finger, put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering, and pour the remaining blood at the base of the altar, and so he shall remove all of its fat, the fat removed from the sacrifice of the peace offering, and the priest will burn it on the altar for a sweet-smelling aroma to the Lord. So, the priest shall make atonement for him, and it shall be forgiven him. Now, notice that's the first time you've seen the sweet-smelling aroma again. First time. The other ones, it did not mention that. Verse 32, and if he brings a lamb as his sin offering, he shall bring a female without blemish. shall lay his hand on the head of the sin offering, kill it as a sin offering at the place where they killed the burnt offering, and the priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger, put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering, and pour all of its remaining blood at the base of the altar. So you see the repetition in this. So he will remove its fat, the fat of the lamb, the removal of the sacrifice of the peace offering, and then the priest shall burn it on the altar according to the offerings made by fire. And so the priest will make atonement for the sin that has been committed, and it shall be forgiven him. So the same prescription over and over, and the lesser of who the people were that did this, so the lesser of the offerings. Now, in verse 1 of chapter 5 and through verse 4, you're going to find very briefly described different offenses that could happen. These are referred to as trespasses. So this is where person-to-person offenses have come up, or towards the priesthood more than likely in a couple of these instances. So let's look at them. Chapter 5, verse 1, if a person sins in hearing the utterance of an oath, and is a witness whether he has seen or known of the matter, if he does not tell it, he bears guilt. That's number 1. If a person touches any unclean thing, whether it is the carcass of an unclean beast, or the carcass of an unclean livestock, or the carcass of unclean creeping things, and he is unaware of it, he also shall be unclean or guilty. If, verse 3, or if he touches human uncleanness, whether uncleanness which a man may be defiled, and he is unaware of it, and then he realizes it, then he shall be guilty. Or if a person swears, speaking thoughtlessly with his lips to do evil or to do good, whether that man may pronounce it by an oath, and he is unaware of it, when he realizes it, then he shall be guilty of any of these matters. And it shall be, when he is guilty of any of these matters, that he shall confess that he has sinned in this thing, and then he will bring a trespass offering to the Lord for his sin which he has committed, a female of the flock, a lamb or a kid of the goats, and so the priest will make atonement for him concerning this sin, or his sin. These 4 things that are mentioned. The first one is dealing with if somebody has information about something that was said, they have knowledge of it, it becomes a matter of public knowledge, or even to the judges, the people that would be overseeing these kind of things, and they don't say anything. They are in a place of trespass. They have knowledge, but they don't bring it to light. They have this ability to bring information that would help, and yet they withhold that. So we see, let's look at it again. It's the first verse. If a person sins in the hearing or the utterance of an oath, and is a witness whether they've seen or know of it. You don't have to be a person who's seen it. You could have heard it. It could have been something that you had perfect first-hand knowledge. But he does not tell it, then he bears the guilt. So it is important that you don't keep things to yourself. If you know something that could help in or assist in what's gone on, and bring it to resolution. If you withhold that, there's a guilt matter that goes on. So that's the first of them. Now the second one is if a person touches anything that is unclean, and this is dealing with animals, or with creeping things, with bugs. There are so many of them that are unclean. Notice it doesn't try to say only these ones. You want to try to get a list of the unclean bugs, hold on long enough, and the animals and all the rest. We're going to get into all of that because it's going to be specified in the law. As we go further, we'll get the list of what is clean and what is unclean as far as animals are concerned, and the list is lengthy. So, with that being known, if a person comes into contact with those things, even if they don't realize it, because it may very well be that those same unclean things touched something else and you touched it by secondhand contact, still a problem. All right? So, if you've touched these unclean things. Now, the third one deals with human things that are unclean. So there could be a number of things that could come from a human body that would be considered as unclean, and that applies here as well, if it comes into contact. Now, if he touches human uncleanness, whatever uncleanness with which a man may be defiled, so that takes in all things, and he is unaware of it, when he realizes it, then he will be guilty. Now, wouldn't you hate that? I didn't know that I did that. I didn't know that I touched that thing, but now that you told me, now I'm guilty. Exactly. Now that you know, so the old saying about ignorance being bliss, well, perhaps. Wouldn't it be nice? Because there's a lot that needs to go on in the idea of cleanness, and so look at what you would have to do in order for that. So then the fourth of these, if a person swears, speaking thoughtlessly, that God is my witness, you're taking oaths, you're swearing, you're doing all those kind of things. This isn't about profanity. This is about the oaths that you're taking, and so it is with his lips to do evil or to do good. So if it's not profanity, because you're not going to be profaning things in a good sense. You're just doing that, God is my witness, I'm going to do this. You take a vow to do this. Whatever a man may pronounce by oath, and then he is unaware of it, when he realizes it, he will be guilty of any of these matters. Now think about this. Look at what has just been said there. Like with oaths, or that you have, let's forget about the clean and the unclean of animals, because we don't really have that same problem nowadays in the same way that they would there. But we still do have the things with the things spoken, with the oaths and all the rest of it. Imagine if every time that we took an oath, or that we had information that could have brought, light to a situation, and we withheld it, or we didn't fulfill our oath, that we had to do this. I think we'd be kind of careful about the things that we say, wouldn't we? Imagine. Because what do you have to do? Think about this. Again, just let's look at the verse 4. God is my witness. I'm going to do X. And you don't do it? Or somebody says, hey, you promised to do this, but you never made good on it. You said you would. God is your witness. Now what do you got to do? What would we say nowadays? I'm sorry. God forgive me. I made an oath by your name. And then we call it good, right? Verse 5. And it shall be when he is guilty of any of these matters that he shall confess that he has sinned in the thing. And then he will bring his trespass offering to the Lord for his sin which he has committed, a female from the flock, a lamb or a kid of the goats, as a sin offering. And so the priest will make atonement for him concerning his sin. Wow. Just because you said, I promise to do this, or I take an oath to do that, and you didn't fulfill it? Something's got to die for your sin? Wow. Seems pretty steep, doesn't it? And it is still something that even these types of things, that is why you hear, let your yes be yes and your no be no. That's a New Testament thing. Think about it. Pretty heavy stuff, huh? Well, in verse 7, now if he is not able to bring a lamb, then he shall bring to the Lord for his trespass which he has committed 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. And so we can go back and look at the sin offerings and the burnt offerings to get an idea of how they're prepared and all the rest. But it doesn't have to be a goat. If you can't do that, the people would be able to bring something of lesser value if they didn't have the ability to bring a goat. It is still, nonetheless, you're going to have to pay according to what you are able, and it is something that you will have to do. It is totally voluntary, even though your sin was inadvertent. Nonetheless, you're still responsible. So, he will bring them to the priest, who shall offer them that which is for the sin offering first, and wring off its head from its neck, and shall divide it completely. And then he shall sprinkle some of the blood of the sin offering on the side of the altar, and the rest of the blood shall be drained out at the base of the altar. It is a sin offering. And he will offer the second as a burnt offering according to the prescribed manner, so the priest will make atonement on his behalf for his sin. Now, verse 11 says, but if he is not able to even bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, then he who has sinned will bring his offering 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour. So this will look very similar to the grain offerings, but it is again according to what they could bring. So the more impoverished people were nonetheless guilty, but they didn't have to bring the same kind of offering because they had no wherewithal to do it. So you'll see, if you can't bring the pigeons, they will bring forth 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a sin offering. He'll put no oil on it, nor shall he put frankincense on it, for it is a sin offering. So if you look at the grain offering that was earlier, these would be the things that you would put in that. This is because there is a trespass that has taken place. So he will bring it to the priest. The priest will take his handful of his memorial portion, burn it on the altar according to the offerings made by fire to the Lord. It is a sin offering. And then the priest will make atonement for him and his sin that he committed in any of these matters, and it shall be forgiven him. The rest shall be the priest as a grain offering. Now, here's a pretty cool thing when you stop to think about it. In this case, when the people do as they are supposed to, in every case, God says, I'll accept it. Why? Because it's on his terms. This is what you must do if you want to make things right. So they would do so to make things right, and God says, I accept that. Now, let it be something that we remember, that as a believer, we are never to make it up as we go along. Then or now, still exactly the same thing, because God has said, whether it's Old Testament or New, this is what is acceptable to me. Anything that is outside of my will is not acceptable. So you may have the best of intentions, but since God has taken the time to write it down, don't take it upon yourself to rewrite it or do it some other way. It's pretty clear. Can we agree? Please? It's that lack of interaction that I always get with you people. So, okay, that's fine. Yeah, I said please. So, in verse 14, so then the Lord spoke to Moses, which tells you that there's a little bit of a change that goes on here. So here, Moses is once again spoken to by the Lord, so there's a little bit of a transition here. And it says, now, if a person commits a trespass and sins unintentionally in regard to the holy things of the Lord. So this is not just taking an oath. This is not anything else. Now it begins to be those things that are holy to the Lord. Now there's a little bit of difficulty in this because it's very ambiguous. It doesn't tell us what those things are. There are a lot of things that God would consider as holy before him. Everything from the land to oaths, to the food that is for the priesthood, the things that are inside the tabernacle. Gosh, there are a lot of things that God defines as holy to him. And they're not specified here. They're not given in some order other than just to say in the holy things. But whatever they are things that are of enough of a value that they could have a value put on them. And it is why most of the people who know the language really well would say this probably deals more with defaulting the priesthood of things that were theirs. But remember, this is also unintentional. Oh, I didn't know that belonged to them. But look at how the restitution is going to go in this. And it will go beyond the priesthood. It will just go person to person. We'll see that in a moment. And that actually goes into chapter 6. The first 7 verses really kind of belong more to chapter 5. And you'll see that in a moment. So, verse 14, so the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, if a person commits a trespass and sins unintentionally, once again, unintentionally, in regard to the holy things of the Lord, then he will bring to the Lord as his trespass offering a ram without blemish from the flocks, with your valuation in shekels of silver according to the shekel of the sanctuary as a trespass offering. There are 2 offerings going on here. So whatever it is that you had taken of the holy things, if it was consecrated and holy, you can't fix that. So you're going to need to make restitution. There's first of all dealing with the sin of doing it, but then there is the idea of restitution to the person from whom you took it, of these holy things. Look at how that works out, verse 16. And then he will make restitution. Remember, the ram is for the sin, but then there is the restitution. He will make restitution for the harm that he has done in regard to the holy thing, and he will add 1/5 to it, another 20%. And he shall make atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering, and then it will be forgiven him. So 2 things going on here. There's got to be the ram that's offered for the sin itself, but then to make restitution for whatever it is that they may have defiled of the holy things. Whether it's food or whatever else, whatever the value of that was, you make full restitution plus 20%. Pretty descript, isn't it? Okay. So verse 17, now if a person sins and commits any of these things which are forbidden to be done by the commandments of the Lord, though he does not know it yet. Now it's unintentional at the time, but the person pretty much knows, in the verses right before this, got a pretty good idea that they've done what they've done and they knew about it kind of right at the time. In this case, it's something that's brought to their attention after the fact. Who knows how long? It doesn't matter. Once it is known, that becomes the issue. Verse 17, if a person sins, commits any of these things which are forbidden to be done, according to the commandments of the Lord, though he does not yet know it, he is still guilty and shall bear the iniquity. And so he shall bring to the priest a ram without blemish from the flock, with your valuation and a trespass offering. So the priest will make atonement for him regarding his ignorance in which he erred and did not know, and it will be forgiven. It is a trespass offering. He has certainly trespassed against the Lord. So again, there was the offense in other things. This is an offense that is directed towards the Lord, and it is, again, dealing with holy things. Whether known immediately or after the fact, it is still the same offering, and there is still the making restitution in addition to the offering before the Lord. Now you'll see in verse 1 of chapter 6, so the Lord then spoke to Moses. If a person sins and commits a trespass against the Lord by lying to his neighbor. So now you see this is something that is done of defrauding. Now again, the offense is before the Lord, first and foremost, but what is it that they've actually done in practice is person to person. This is the idea of defrauding. If a person sins and commits a trespass against the Lord by lying. Now remember, let me make sure that we read that carefully. The offense is directed against the Lord, but it's because you have done this brother to brother, sister to sister, brother to sister, that kind of a thing, right? By lying to his neighbor about what was delivered to him for his safekeeping, or so it was left in surety, or a pledge, or about a robbery, or if he has extorted from his neighbor, or if he has found what was lost and lies concerning it, and swears falsely in any of these things that a man may do in which he sins. So here's what it is, and if that person is guilty, now here's what needs to happen. Here's an interesting thing that you'll notice. I don't know about you, but when you read through these things, if you've spent time around the Old Testament, you can start to think of times when they did exactly these same things. And God had a real problem with it. I think a lot of this around, you're going to notice, it's been a while since we've been there, but if you started to read through like Ezra and Nehemiah, they were doing these kinds of things. Nehemiah in particular had a real problem with this kind of stuff going on. The defrauding of the priesthood and the idea that people were taking extortion kind of money and interest against their brothers who needed things, to the point where they were beginning to take the property of the people because they couldn't pay the debt. This is the kind of stuff that God hated. And here it is all the way back in the very beginning. Don't do that they were doing it in just horrible ways long after the captivity. I mean, down the road, 1,000 years down the road, they're still doing this kind of stuff to one another. It's just terrible. So this is where God puts it in place, that this is what is to be done. So verse 3 says, if this is what happens. Then verse 4 says, so then it will be, because he has sinned and is guilty, that he will restore what he has stolen, or the thing that was left that he has extorted, the thing that which was extorted, or what was delivered to him for safekeeping, or the lost thing which was found, or all that, or that about which he has sworn falsely, then he will restore it in its full value, and then 1/5 more to it, and give it to whomever it belongs on the day of his trespass offering. So this will be in addition to all of the other things. Now you're going to make restitution to the person that you've defrauded. You've lied to them, you've extorted them, they've given you something to hold for them, and you've taken it, or you've lost it, or somehow, some way you're not able to restore it. You will restore it in its full value plus 20%, 1/5 more. Okay? Verse 6, and then he will bring his trespass offering to the Lord, a ram without blemish from the flock, with your valuation as a trespass offering to the priest. Can you imagine, again, if all this stuff was still in place and that our nation was somehow a covenant people? Think of what the banks would have to do. I couldn't resist. You know, let me mention something. Well, let's do the last verse here. Verse 7, so the priest will make atonement for him before the Lord, and it shall be forgiven for any one of these things that he may have done in which he trespasses. Now, we've got an idea there. There's your 5 offerings. Now, we're going to get a little bit more definition in chapter 6 and 7, but it's going to be dealing with the offerings that have already been explained. It's just going to give us further definition. There was a discussion that I had earlier today, and it's coming up a lot for whatever reason, but it has been for years. There's a passage that I'm sure a lot of us have probably heard thrown out there, but I want to deal with it because right here, you'll notice that God is giving instruction to his people Israel, right? They aren't even back in the land yet. These are the sons of Jacob, the tribes of Israel, making their way in their time of coming out of the captivity, or their time in Egypt, rather, their servitude, and now they're being brought back into the nation that God had promised. To this point, they have never really fully taken control of the land like God had told them he would let them do in the first place. The promise was to Abraham and Isaac, to Jacob. They never really realized that in its fullness. Now God's bringing them back, and this is going to be the one time when they're going to, more so than at any time until recently, where they really lay hold of the land. And then they will begin to populate it and take it as they had said. So here you have instructions to those people by God, to his people directly. Let's make sure we understand this. Did God ever do any such thing with the United States? No, of course not. So why is it that we start to see churches, and the patriotic ones at that, start to try to take the promises made to Israel and adapt them to the church? Why do we do that? Well, I shouldn't say we. I don't include myself in that. Why do the churches do that? So the one that gets thrown out all the time, if my people, right? If my people, who are called by my name. I said this to somebody in here earlier today. Please show me the place where there was the formal place that God had established for worship in the United States. There is no place. Who's our Abraham? We don't have one. So for the United States to be used as if my people is just such a gross misrepresentation of the nation. Because what was being done at the time? It was the dedication of the temple by Solomon. And when God says, if my people, it was in response to Solomon saying, then God, we want you to be here at this place that we've built for you. But if we falter, and if we come to our senses, and if we will pray and ask that you will forgive, will you forgive? And he goes through a whole litany of those things in chapter 6, and then God answers. And part of that is to say, now if you'll do all the things that you said, and if you will ask for forgiveness, I'll give it to you. If you don't, I'm going to wipe you like a dish. There won't be anything left. And the people, when they come by, are going to say, how did God let this happen? Why did he do this to his people? So then he says, but if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wickedness, then I will hear their prayer and I'll heal their land. So he's speaking specifically to those people. And we are in a different covenant now anyway, because we are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. So revival is individual. It's not happening in this country. So those people crying out for revival, look, if the whole nation decided to get their act together and cry out to God, would he forgive? You bet. But we're not a covenant nation. So when you hear people talking like that, it's like, read your Bible, folks. You just sound foolish when you do that. So if we were to cry out to God, any of us on an individual basis, absolutely he hears. No question about it. The cool thing about it is what you see there in 2 Chronicles in chapter 7, God still has a people that he recognizes. He made a covenant with Abraham, and it was a forever covenant. So God still has big plans in Israel, trust me. He still has those things. They're the only covenant nation that he has ever had. And he gave them very specific instruction. So where's the church in all of this? We have promises made to us as the church. There's no doubt about it. And so we are able to walk in those, but we are in a different covenant, and we cannot claim these promises that were made to a people, though we can walk in the newness of life that's given to us in the person Jesus, who was a Jewish man. Amen? Who kept all of the Jewish law perfectly. Pretty cool, huh? All right, so chapter 6 and chapter 7 we will do not next week. I won't be here next Sunday night. We'll do them the following Sunday night, and then we'll be able to start moving through once we're done with the offerings. So let's stand, and let's have a word of prayer. Father, again, we thank you as we can come to you and study your word and grow in our understanding of things. And our gratitude that should be natural as we read these things and recognize that you are still the same perfect God who requires perfection, and yet all of what we could not do fell upon your Son, the one who saved us. And we thank you for the way that you have made that we could be reconciled to you, the sin offerings of your Son, and how we are able to come. We must acknowledge these things as they did as well. May we be willing to acknowledge all of our faults and come to you, the one who has offered for us an offering for sin, in that we have your Son. So we thank you. We pray that you'd be glorified in our lives and help us to be mindful of those things in our own lives that we must bring before you, that we might walk rightly and honorably before you. We thank you and give you praise in Jesus' name. Amen.